Welcome to China Forum, where leading experts discuss important topics regarding China and the U.S.-China relationship. Today, we are continuing our series, China Forum, Conversations with Ambassadors. Understanding our past diplomatic relationship with China and learning lessons from the diplomats who helped shape it are vital for ensuring strong diplomacy and effective China policy in the future. Last time on China Forum, we had the pleasure of speaking with Ambassador Chaz W. Freeman, Jr. about his recollections from the period of U.S.-China rapprochement and normalization. If you have not seen it yet, I encourage you to watch it on the U.S.-China Policy Foundation YouTube channel. Today, we are honored to be joined once again by Ambassador Freeman to hear more about his career and experiences in U.S.-China diplomacy. Ambassador Freeman served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Charge d'Affaires at Bangkok and Beijing, and the Principal American Interpreter during President Nixon's 1972 trip to China. He was previously Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council, Co-Chair of the U.S.-China Policy Foundation, and Chair of the Committee for the Republic. Among his many publications are Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige, The Diplomat's Dictionary, and Arts of Power, Statecraft and Diplomacy. He is currently a visiting scholar at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome, Ambassador Freeman.
Glad to be back.
In our previous conversation, we discussed your participation in U.S.-China rapprochement and normalization. Today, I hope we can talk more about your time posted in Beijing. You served at the embassy in Beijing from 1981 to 1984 as DCM in Charge d'Affaires. Can you describe your role at the embassy and some of the embassy's key priorities during that time?
Well, this was an entirely new relationship. We hadn't had a relationship of any kind for 30 years, although we had begun a process of rapprochement in 1971-72. 1979 to 1981, I was the country director for China at the State Department. Dick Holbrooke, who was then the assistant secretary, asked me what our objectives for the new relationship should be. And I wrote a paper which argued that we should try to have the same relationship we would have had if we'd not had 30 years of estrangement, and that we should accomplish that within 5 years. And that was approved as a policy guidance document. And I had the pleasure of implementing it, first in Washington and then as charge and later DCM in Beijing. I participated or oversaw the negotiation of 36 treaties and agreements. And when I got to Beijing, I discovered, of course, that the former U.S. Liaison Office, which had formerly been transformed into an embassy, still had many of the unformed characteristics of the past relationship. So I sat down. I'm probably unusual in the sense that I had considerable management experience as a result of 2 tours managing programs in the U.S. Information Agency, and I was also an administrative officer in the Department of State. So I sat down and designed a future embassy, meaning what sort of functions would this embassy have to have if you looked at a 20-year period? How would you develop career ladders for people to fill those positions? What jobs should be language qualified and what didn't need to be? And so forth and so on. And I submitted this plan and it was approved, and it became the basis for the development of what is now the robust relationship that the U.S. Embassy in Beijing supports.
Oh, wow. So you're basically starting from scratch.
It was interesting. I mean, I would say in a way it was probably the most creative diplomatic moment of the last half of the last century.
And so, as you mentioned, when you were beginning, official U.S. PRC relations were still new, and that you had the challenges of getting that relationship started. And one of the first major tests to that fledgling relationship was, of course, over the U.S. relations with Taipei, and more specifically, arms sales. What was that diplomatic maneuvering like during that period?
Well, in the normalization agreement, the U.S. and China could not reach agreement on the subject of continuing U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. And despite that disagreement, normalization went forward. But for the first year, while the U.S. Republic of China Defense Treaty was still in effect, the United States suspended arms sales to Taiwan. We then resumed them, and we did so with language that reflected the discussions with the Chinese. We resumed the sale of, quote, carefully selected defensive weapons on a restrained basis. In the 1980 campaign, Ronald Reagan disagreed both with normalization with China. He wanted to restore official ties to Taipei, and he also thought that Taiwan should be able to buy whatever weapons it wanted in the United States. This led to a crisis that was about 18 months long and culminated in negotiations over the course of 1982. Most of them conducted at my dining table in my apartment in Sanlitun in Beijing, and this resulted in a communique in which basically both sides had to be more explicit, but return to the normalization understanding. That is, the Chinese had to accept that the U.S. was going to continue arms sales for a while to Taiwan. The U.S. had to accept that it couldn't do so indefinitely. But on that basis, we reached a compromise, and it produced exactly the results that we'd hoped for. It gave Taipei an incentive to drop its refusal to talk to Beijing and to enter into a political dialogue with it, which then resulted in the so-called One China Consensus. In other words, Taipei had to look for non-military means of managing its security and autonomy vis-a-vis the rest of China. And Beijing had a powerful incentive to send every signal it could of peaceful intent to keep the U.S. reducing the arms sales to Taiwan. That worked for 10 years until the 1992 election, when election considerations catalyzed a decision to make the largest U.S. arms sale ever to anywhere, 150 F-16s to Taipei. That broke the communique framework and effectively remilitarized the issue, an issue that had been demilitarized. I gave an account of those negotiations, by the way, at a so-called master class on diplomacy at the Foreign Service Institute, and it's posted on my website, chazfreeman.net, for anybody who's interested. But we have a remilitarized Taiwan issue as a result of the violation of the 1982 communique.
As you mentioned, these tensions went over a year with negotiations. Was there ever a point where you thought, if this is going to fail?
I was skeptical. The Chinese were clearly signaling that they might reverse the normalization process, sever relations with us. I didn't believe that. However, a friend, and I don't want to be too specific about who it was because he's still alive, later told me that Deng Xiaoping had pre-positioned a tape at Radio Beijing announcing the severance of diplomatic relations with the United States. So I think the Chinese were, in fact, I thought they were bluffing. I'm not sure they were. In any event, it was pretty tense 18 months, or basically a year of negotiation, pretty tense, and at no point was it certain that we could resolve this issue.
What kind of lessons do you think for future negotiation and just finding common ground when it seems that there's an insurmountable difference on sides can you learn from these types of negotiations?
Well, I think you have to begin with an assessment of your own national interests, a very clear-eyed one. The United States and China in 1979 normalized relations. Later, in 1979, because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, a relationship which was one of sort of tacit opposition agreement to oppose the Soviet Union became explicit. the United States and China established joint listening stations on Chinese territory to monitor Soviet troop movements and weapons development. The Chinese began to export Soviet designed equipment to the United States for use in training our forces to fight the Soviets in Europe and elsewhere. Of course, we had a huge program of buying weapons from China clandestinely for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So clear, when Ronald Reagan discovered that there were these interests at stake in the relationship with China, he reversed course on his effort to undo normalization. He did, however, stick with his idea of selling Taiwan whatever it wanted militarily until it became apparent that that too would jeopardize the relationship, at which point he backed off. So I would say keep a clear eye on your interests, be prepared to be flexible in their pursuit, recognize that you have to make choices, sometimes unpalatable, listen to the other side, not just to what it says, but to what it doesn't say, and do your best to see if you can isolate differences and reach for common ground.
What role do you think the language of the joint communique affected the ability for each side to sell this document, sell this communique back home?
I don't think it was popular in either country. Certainly those of us who negotiated it were not thrilled to have to do so, because, as I said, essentially both sides had to return to the basic understanding that had been reached during normalization, but to humiliate themselves by admitting what they'd agreed, which wasn't popular with Chinese or American nationalists, and certainly not popular with people in Taiwan. And of course, the dissatisfaction or the awkwardness of the U.S. relationship with Taiwan, which is one where we traded form for substance. We kept the substance of our relationship, but we gave up the form. This has never been comfortable for Americans, and for the last 42 years, Americans have been salami slicing the agreement to the point where, frankly, the framework doesn't exist anymore, which is why the Taiwan issue is once again a flashpoint and a possible casus belli.
Mm-hmm. So during your time in Beijing, what are some of the other key events and memories that stand out the most?
Well, I think the thing I was proudest of was putting the Marine Guards back in uniform. In the liaison office period, for a variety of reasons, which are kind of interesting, but I won't go into them, the Marine Guards had to give up their uniforms and wear mufti, ordinary clothes. Now, this is bad for discipline. It's bad for morale. And we had just normalized relations with China, and I thought it was time to normalize the role of the Marine Guards. So I did this on my own. I told the Chinese I was going to do it. At the same time, I told Washington I was going to do it. I knew the Chinese were going to raise hell, which they did. They actually went to the Secretary of State to complain. But I also knew that there was nobody in Washington who was likely to have the guts to tell the Marines to take off their uniforms. So I got away with it, and it worked.
Oh, wow. Since your time working in Beijing and later on China affairs back in the U.S., how have you seen the U.S.-China relationship change?
Well, China seems to renegotiate its relationship with the world and the United States every decade or so. I've been involved in this relationship now for somewhat over 50 years. And I can recall 1969 clashes with the Soviet Union on the borders of Heilongjiang and Xinjiang, a near war, and the beginning of détente with the United States. That marked a turning point in Chinese policy and China's relationships with the world. 1979, 10 years later, we achieved normalization, and China began its program of reform and opening. We also had the Afghan development I referred to earlier. That is, we moved from just a relationship of which the United States was trying to protect China from the Soviet Union to one of active entente against the Soviet Union, a limited partnership for limited purposes. 10 years after that, there was the Tiananmen uprising and its suppression, and then the collapse of the Soviet Empire. That's the year that the Berlin Wall came down. So the strategic rationale for U.S.-China relations was largely removed by the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and the warmth in the relationship was done away with by what happened at Tiananmen. The decade after that, more or less, 2001, China joins the WTO, becomes part of the capitalist world, and turns out to be a more competitive capitalist than anyone. 10 years after that, 2010, the U.S. begins to confront China about South China Sea claims, and also confronts Russia and begins to push China and Russia together, which we're still doing. In 2020, 10 years after that, we have the Trump rupture with China, which has basically been confirmed by the Biden administration. China and the U.S. are no longer on speaking terms. So we've gone back to something more like the 1950s than any time since normalization. I'd say U.S.-China relations are never dull. They are sort of roller coaster ride. 10 years from now, there may be yet another shift if this pattern holds.
So during your career at the State Department, you spent time both at postings in country and at home in D.C. What did these different experiences teach you about the role of diplomacy?
Well, working in the District of Columbia, the capital, is very different from working overseas. The skills of securocrats, that is, which are bureaucratic and political maneuver and management upward of senior policymakers, are very different from diplomacy, where diplomacy is dependent on cross-cultural communication and empathy with foreigners, sufficient to instruct you how to persuade them that it's in their interest to do things our way. So I would say the courtiers, that is, the people who hang around the court or the capital, to succeed have to be sycophants. They have to pander to their superiors. Diplomats have to be persuasive to their peers. And I think it's a big mistake to assume that work on foreign policy in the capital automatically equips someone with the skills necessary to implement foreign policy abroad. They're very different worlds.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So which did you prefer?
I like operating overseas. I think I turned out to be a pretty good bureaucratic infighter. I can do that, but I get much more satisfaction out of persuading a foreigner to do something the United States wants them to do than I do out of getting a clearance on a paper in a bureaucracy.
So as you mentioned, diplomacy certainly takes many shapes, and there's one form that a lot of people know and associate with China, panda diplomacy. Do you have any stories about the Nixons welcoming the first pandas to D.C.?
Well, I ended up as both the escort officer for the pandas and their interpreter, as well as the interpreter for the small Chinese team that accompanied them. And I was the interpreter when Pat Nixon received the pandas officially at the National Zoo, along with Ted Reed, who was then the wonderful man who was then the National Zoo director. I think the pandas, I mean, they are obviously charming. Pandas have been a unique asset for Chinese diplomacy, and they were a great hit in Washington. They still are, as they have been everywhere. I went on with the group from the Beijing National Zoo to various other installations in the United States, and including in New York, the Bronx Zoo, and so forth. I certainly expanded my Chinese vocabulary about all sorts of strange beasts and birds and snakes and things, and it was a thoroughly enjoyable interlude.
Is it true the panda had its own plane?
No, well, the pandas had special crates. No, they came in on a regular plane, but they had special crates that had been beautifully designed and decorated by people in Beijing. I think we got the better of that deal. We sent Milton the muskox to China in return, an Alaskan muskox who was in the Beijing Zoo for a while and then died of what was described as hardware disease, which I take it is eating some piece of hardware. Anyway, no, we got, that was a great moment, and it was a smart move on the Chinese that helped to sell the normalization that we were embarked upon.
It's very interesting how things seemingly simple as a panda can really help the overall sentiment and relationship.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the U.S.-China relationship in the broader context over the course of the 2 centuries or so that we've had a relationship, it's been subject to wild swings in public opinion in both countries, but especially in the United States, and many illusions which then are disappointed and frustrated. Sometimes it produces very strange things. As I think I may have mentioned earlier, one of the striking things to me about the opening to China was the extent to which American conservatives found they loved Chinese discipline and regimentation and short haircuts. I wouldn't have predicted that. Small things, Deng Xiaoping putting on a cowboy hat, can take on a significance well beyond their intrinsic significance.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the key lessons you learned that you would like to share with future diplomats?
Well, I had an amazing 30-year career, and I have no complaints about it. In fact, it was a wonderful learning experience, which was what I hoped it would be, not only in terms of foreign languages and cultures, but how to solve or at least finesse problems. Everywhere I served, I learned the local language, in part just for situational awareness. When you're sitting across the table from someone, you kind of like to know when they're talking to their colleagues, whether they're planning how to cut you up into small pieces or whether they are talking about how to engage you. It's also very useful to be able to eavesdrop on side conversations. When I was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, I was able to understand King Fahd and his staff discussions when he would seek advice in the course of a conversation. He didn't realize I spoke Arabic, and until one day he asked me a question. I made the mistake of not waiting for the interpreter answering it. So I think situational awareness is a good thing, worth investing in, and more than that, I learned a lot of other things. The best contributions I think I learned I could make in my reporting and analysis, which is a large part of diplomatic work, was that I should write not to a general audience, but to specific individuals. And I should try to help correct their stereotypes, which got in the way of their understanding the actual circumstances we were dealing with. And I should try to cause them to question the thoughtless narratives that tend to dominate policy discussions in our capital, like others, and thereby guide policy decisions. So I learned to write in a way that I never would have learned if I had not had that experience. I also learned to control myself, to put the interests of the United States ahead of my own emotional reaction to things. Lots of times I was engaged in discussions, delivering protests, demarches, in circumstances where what the other side believed or said was deeply offensive or challenging to me. And I learned that indignation, unless it's purposeful, it's an old saying that diplomats never insult anyone inadvertently. We always do it deliberately. Indignation can underscore the intensity of feelings, but it really never persuades anyone. So that's an important insight, I think. And diplomats are sent abroad to advance our national interests, as I said, by persuading foreigners to do things that benefit us, not to act on the fantasies of domestic audiences or strike political poses that appeal to them. What's wrong with Chinese foreign policy right now is what is wrong also with a lot of American foreign policy is that we are basically striking poses rather than talking to the people we claim to be addressing. We're not empathetic on either side. And I learned that you can and should sustain personal friendships and cordial relationships with foreign counterparts, despite fundamental and often confrontational official interactions with them. So I used to go into the foreign ministry in Beijing and sit down with the vice foreign minister or assistant foreign minister that I was dealing with, and I would sprawl in those great overstuffed chairs that they have, and my counterpart would do likewise, and I would, say, "How did your kid do on that exam? Did you ever get to see that movie we talked about?" And so forth. And after about 5 minutes, I'd pull myself up straight, put my knees together, my hands on my knees, and I would say, "I have been instructed by my government to protest in the very strongest terms the absolutely outrageous behavior of your government with regard to X, Y, or Z. And it is impossible to understand how any government claiming to be civilized could do the things that you are doing." And my counterpart, of course, would say, "I categorically reject everything you have said. It's all your fault," and so forth. And we would go on for a while and make sure that we conveyed our government's positions. And then we would look at each other and realize that we'd done our job and slouch back in the chairs. And I would say, or he would say, "How about a picnic at the Ping Tombs this Sunday? You up for that?" I think compartmentalizing official interactions in a way that preserves friendship, cordiality, is really important. And finally, I would say I learned to understand reasoning processes that people back home condemned as, quote, irrational, unquote. My experience, when you condemn something as irrational, all you're doing is saying that you're too lazy to try to understand it. I think you should always be willing to take the time to try to see things from the other side's perspective, however much you may disagree with it. And that's essential to effective diplomacy. So I guess I learned, a bunch of stuff, and what I've just said is far from exhaustive, but best I can do on the spur of the moment.
Thank you. In the line of advice, what advice might you have for policymakers working on U.S.-China relations specifically today, and what suggestions might you have for Biden's China policy?
Well, I think the first thing is we need to get back on speaking terms with China. We need to address each other respectfully. Mm-hmm. We need to listen to what the other guy is saying, we need to think about what we're going to say. I don't agree with the notion that it's always best to talk rather than not talk. If you don't know what you're going to say, you shouldn't be talking. So we need to think carefully about what we want to say, but more importantly, we need to think about how that's going to strike the other side. Is it going to be persuasive or not? And we need to focus, in the case of China, it seems to me, not on how to hurt China, but how to benefit the United States. What can we get from China that is useful to us? I would argue that we need to rebuild this relationship basically brick by brick from the bottom up. That means there's a Chinese phrase, 求同存异, to look for common points in common while reserving differences, setting them aside until you can build an atmosphere in which you can finally address them. I think that is what we should be doing. So we need to look for things that are relatively easy to reach agreement on, and maybe reductions in tariffs and things like that would be a good place to start, and rebuild an atmosphere of mutual confidence and a degree of trust so that we can move on to the more difficult things. In the area of trade, for example, that's our differences over Chinese industrial policy, mainly. I think IPR is yesterday's issue to a great extent. Anyway, and the fact that it's yesterday's issue suggests that it ought to be something we can agree upon. The Chinese now place a lot of emphasis on protecting the rights of their own innovators. So I would argue, start by taking on the easier things and move slowly up the chain to the more difficult ones. I'm not confident that's going to happen. And the reason for that is essentially that, as I see it, U.S.-China policy, which was supposed to be reviewed, I mean, the administration said it would review it, hasn't really been reviewed. And the reason for that is that it's politically explosive to do so. If the Biden administration were to suggest that it was going to change the Trump policies, you have a degree of congressional berserkers who would immediately assault the administration and thereby jeopardize the administration's agenda for domestic reform and opening, which I think are essential. We need to get our act back together as a country. And we need to restore our ability to compete with others like China by setting a good example that others want to copy, not by trying to force our ideas onto them at the point of a bayonet or through a bomb site. So I'd argue that for the time being, probably until the 2022 elections clarify whether the administration has sufficient political maneuvering room to do so, there isn't going to be a reset in the relationship. There should be. But domestic politics are in command.
Mm-hmm. On a lighter note, I'm sure in your years of foreign service, you have some fun stories and anecdotes. Are there any that you might want to share?
You know, as I said, I had an amazing career. I began in India. One of my first acts there was to help quell a mutiny aboard a ship. I did a burial at sea. I had a run-in with the ambassador that got me thrown out of the State Department into the U.S. Information Agency. I was a judge in the 1967 Miss India contest. I learned Tamil. I fell in love with a lot of things about India. That was my first tour. I could tell a story from every one of the other ones. So there's not enough time today to do that. I was a spear carrier and once in a while on stage more prominently in the opening to China, which I had joined the Foreign Service in part to take part in, as I mentioned the last time. I was involved in removing Cubans from Angola and the South Africans from Namibia, and gaining independence from Namibia, and ending colonialism in Africa. The only time I have a degree in Latin American studies, and I went to the National University of Mexico. I used my Spanish on only 2 occasions. One was talking to Fidel Castro, and the other was as part of the negotiations, and the other was when I presented 2 patrol boats to the government of Equatorial Guinea, which is the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa, which they promptly used to go out and commit an act of piracy with by taking down a Mercedes carrier en route to apartheid-era South Africa. And I thought, that was enough in my career, that these are big things. And yet, finally, I had what was probably the ambassadorship of the century in Saudi Arabia, where George H.W. Bush had assured me nothing ever happened. And I ended up with 550,000 support staff in uniform under the aegis of the embassy, and a 4-star general as my military advisor. So I was his diplomatic advisor. So the Gulf War from 1990 to 91 was certainly a memorable event in every respect. And I went on from there and ended my career at the Defense Department with a plan for building a Europe-wide defense architecture, which worked for a while and then got subverted and became a basis for reestablishment of confrontation with Russia. I helped talk the South African army out of a coup against Nelson Mandela in the elections of 1989, 90. And I reestablished military relations with China after they'd been broken during Tiananmen. So, there are too many points. At some point,
never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. And a lot of it not to do with China.
Thank you. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
United States has been, for 150 years, pretty much unchallenged as the greatest power on the planet. And we're losing that status. Not so much because we're in decline, although we are, but because others are returning to wealth and power, or achieving it for the first time. And I think we've come to the point where the margin of error that we once enjoyed has shrunk. And we can't afford to continue staffing the diplomatic function with amateurs who have to learn on the job. If we're going to compete, and we do need to, we must be as professional in our diplomacy as we are in our warfare. And the more professional we are in our diplomacy, the less warfare we will have to practice. So that's sort of my concluding thought.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for today. Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for sharing your memories and insights with us. As always, it was a great pleasure.
Pleasure was mine.
To everyone watching at home, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on China Forum.